For the next two sessions, I'm going to be discussing the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. In particular, how events of this early republic, these early years of the republic, will test the effectiveness of the Constitution, and they'll come to shape the patterns that will characterize American politics for many, many years to come. Once the Constitution was ratified in 1788 by a minimum of 9 states, it became the law of the land. And as such, the states were now tasked with electing new representatives new members to represent themselves in Congress. These elections will take place in January and February of 1789. So the states will elect new representatives to go to Congress, and this new Congress will meet in April of 1789 in New York City, which at the time was decided to be the nation's capital. And here we're looking at the Federal Hall in New York City on Wall Street, and this was the site of the first capital of the United States. Congress will meet here and begin the business of running the country under this new Constitution. One of the first things that they do is to elect a new president, and this also happens in April of 1789. Congress will elect George Washington as the first president. John Adams will be his vice president. It's interesting to note here too that at this time there is no popular vote for the office of president. The president is selected by the members of Congress, the Electoral College. So they're the only ones that will vote to elect the president. There's no popular vote for president. That'll change later on in years to come, but initially the president is going to be elected by Congress, as will the senators in Congress. Members of the House of Representatives are elected by popular vote by people in their state, and when Congress convenes, these representatives will select the president, and of course the state legislatures will select their senators to come to Congress. So election of officials in these early years of the Republic is quite a bit different than it is today. It's just important to remember that as we move into the story, that some of these men were not elected by the people. So let's talk a little bit about George Washington. First president of the United States, elected by Congress in spring of 1789. Washington was kind of an obvious choice. He was already very popular. Many people in Congress had worked with him for many years. He was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolution. He presided over the Constitutional Convention. And so he was already well known in this circle of leaders. They had a great deal of respect for him, and he was kind of an obvious choice. So Washington, once he takes office, he is very keenly aware of the fact that everything he says and does will become a model for the office of the president. He knows that he needs to tread very carefully here and not to get too creative in terms of how he executes his office or his responsibilities of his office, because he knows that whatever he does will be looked at by future presidents as the model for what's supposed to happen. So he's very cautious, very careful during his early years to stick as closely to the Constitution as he possibly can. And of course, this illustration here, this is George Washington taking the oath of office on the veranda of the nation's capital in New York City. And if you ever go to New York City today, on this spot where the Capitol building used to be, there's a statue of George Washington. This is right on Wall Street, across from the New York Stock Exchange. There's a statue of George Washington standing there in this pose, basically, as kind of a monument to where our nation's government began. So George Washington, some of the things that he does that are going to set a precedent for future leaders. He's a firm believer in the separation of powers. the office of the president and the office of Congress their powers are separate and distinct, and he's very careful not to interfere with the duties of Congress. He knows that Congress alone can make the laws, so George Washington basically stays out of Congress's way. He never spoke out against a candidate. He never campaigned for a candidate for Senate or for the House of Representatives. He never endorsed or criticized any members of Congress publicly. Again, he did not want to interfere with that process. He never pushed or proposed legislation. That's Congress's duty. So he did not ever publicize an agenda as far as what he wanted to accomplish while in office. He left the lawmaking up to Congress. He didn't try to influence that process at all. He also believed that his power of veto should be used only if the law that Congress had proposed was not consistent with the Constitution. He didn't veto laws based on whether or not he liked it or not. He used the veto only if he thought that that law was unconstitutional, or if he thought that law was not going to be a good law for the country. So he tried to keep as much of his personal opinions out of his decision-making process as possible. So George Washington is very, very conservative here in terms of how he uses the power of his office, how he uses his influence. He was very aware of the fact that many people look to him for leadership, that his words carried a lot of weight. He was very careful with those words not to exercise any undue influence on the legislative process. Another thing that's going to happen during this first presidency, Congress, this brand new Congress operating under our new Constitution. Basically, we are taking the Constitution out for a test drive. Up to this point, the Constitution is essentially just a piece of paper, a theory, a collection of ideas and proposals on how to run this country. We've never actually put these into practice. So this first presidency, not only is George Washington having to establish a model for what the president is supposed to do, Congress also is trying to establish a model or a pattern for how the nation should be governed. So a lot of what happens in this first few years of this new Congress are an attempt to try and to put into practice what they've discussed or what they've written into the Constitution. So one of the first things going to happen is our federal bureaucracy is going to begin to grow. They realize early on that based on the duties outlined for each branch of government in the Constitution, it'll be very difficult for a single person, namely the president in the executive office, to execute all of these duties. So they start forming various departments that will be responsible for special duties within the government. So we see the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, the Department of War being established as executive level departments to execute some of these duties of the federal government. And these were obvious ones. Department of State, of course, handles any type of diplomatic tasks, foreign relations, and so forth. The Department of Treasury handles all of our money, and of course the Department of War handles any kind of all matters concerning defense in times of war. They called it the Department of War at this point because the only time we really activated our military was during times of war. So the War Department was concerned only with fighting wars as they came up. They won't change to the Department of Defense until the mid-20th century, which is what we have today, the Department of Defense. It replaced the old War Department because the nature of our nation's defense had changed somewhat since these early Republic years. So our three executive departments, State, Treasury, and War, tasked with performing the most basic functions of our government at this point. This bureaucracy will grow over time. Every subsequent presidents and subsequent administrations will add new departments to the federal government. Of course, today we have numerous executive departments that are responsible for a wide variety of things. As our nation grows and becomes more complex, so will this federal bureaucracy. So in terms of what we might describe today as big government, this federal bureaucracy, this begins to grow immediately. I mean, in the first few months of our nation's operation under this new constitution, our federal bureaucracy begins to start growing and becoming a little bit more complex. Again, to meet the demands of governing a large republic. Some of the first acts of Congress are intended to try to specify or clarify things that were left open to interpretation by the Constitution. So this Judiciary Act of 1789 is going to be one of those first acts of Congress. The Bill of Rights, of course, was added very early on. That was one of the first acts of Congress. But this Judiciary Act 1789 was intended to provide a little bit more clarification with regards to the judicial branch of the government, especially in terms of the Supreme Court and so on and so forth. So keep in mind, it's important to remember that prior to the Constitution, there was no court system at the federal level. The only courts were at the state level. So this is a new piece of our government, this federal judicial branch. So we need to clarify what they're going to be doing exactly, especially when we compare it to the state courts. So the Judiciary Act, it creates the office of Attorney General. Basically, this is the United States lawyer on retainer, so to speak. So any matters concerning the United States government that would be serious enough to be presented before the court, the U.S. Attorney General will represent the federal government in these matters. It establishes a number of Supreme Court justices. Originally, there were 6 Supreme Court justices, which was somewhat problematic because with an even number of justices, there's always a chance for a split decision, a tie, basically. They realized this early on, and they changed the number of justices to an odd number in order to always have a majority vote. So no matter what happens, with an odd number of justices, you will be able to have some sort of definitive ruling. With an even number of justices, there's always a risk of having a split or tied vote, which would complicate matters, especially in situations where a court needs to make some sort of ruling on a sensitive issue. There needs to be some kind of a definitive ruling and not a tie. They'll debate this for years. By the time we get to the end of the Civil War, the number of Supreme Court justices will have changed about 6 times. So they're going to go through a lot of changes in this number of justices until they finally settle on 9, which is what we have today. So at any rate, this Judiciary Act will establish the number of Supreme Court justices. It'll also create 13 federal district courts. And 13, as you may already have guessed, is the number of states, so there's going to be a federal district court in each state. So if there's a dispute under the Constitution within a state, that dispute can be held, can be tried at the federal district court in that state, and if they're unable to come to a resolution in that district court, then the case will go up to the Supreme Court. So again, this is just to add another layer, another echelon of federal justice to make it more convenient. Basically, that's the main reason for this, is so that if there's any kind of dispute under federal law, they don't have to all come to the nation's capital to the Supreme Court. They can try that in a federal district court. This is the important one here. The fact that this Judiciary Act is going to limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court or the federal court. This was a concern of a lot of people, especially the anti-federalists and the states' rights proponents. They were very concerned that the existence of a federal court would begin to interfere with the rights of the states and their own court system as far as handling state laws. So this Judiciary Act of 1789 will specify that the Supreme Court or the federal courts will only have jurisdiction in federal matters, basically any matters regarding the U.S. Constitution. So they will not interfere in any kind of internal state matters. Whatever happens in the state of Virginia, that's Virginia's business. Virginia courts will deal with that, and the federal court will not get involved. But any disputes under federal law, say a dispute between Virginia and Maryland over who has access to the Chesapeake Bay, this is just an example. The Supreme Court will hear this because it involves more than one state. It involves a dispute under federal law, so here's where the federal court will have jurisdiction. So this is very important. It went a long way toward reassuring the states that the federal government was not going to interfere in their internal matters unless it was a matter of federal law. And of course, once all this is passed, George Washington will appoint John Jay as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, of course subject to Senate approval, per the checks and balances we talked about last week. So John Jay is our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and we've got a lot more clarification now as to what exactly the federal court's duties and functions are. Another thing that's going to take place early on is that the president will begin to form his cabinet. Now, it's important to note here that the Constitution does not specifically empower the president to create a cabinet. It doesn't say anything about a cabinet in the Constitution. It mentions the departments, these executive level departments and their duties, but it does not mention anything about the president forming a cabinet. And basically, the president's cabinet is the secretaries of each of these departments will gather together and form basically an advisory body to the president. And George Washington, as an effective leader as he was just one man. He knew that he was not able to execute all the duties by himself. So he regularly consulted with his cabinet. Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury. And these men regularly consulted with George Washington and advised him, even on matters not really concerned with their department. Jefferson often advised the president on other matters, not just matters of international diplomacy, as did Hamilton. In fact, Hamilton was one of Washington's closest friends and advisors. While he was the Secretary of the Treasury, he advised Washington on a variety of matters as well. Again, this cabinet is not prescribed by the Constitution. So George Washington is taking the initiative here. He's doing this on his own, creating this cabinet, and this will become a model for future presidents. Future presidents will also appoint members to this cabinet, and they will use the cabinet as an advisory body in the process of executing their duties. And of course, as time goes on and the duties of the executive branch become more complex, more cabinet members or departments will be added to this list. Initially, it's just the State, Treasury, and War departments. One of Hamilton's first duties as Secretary of Treasury is to produce a report on the public credit. George Washington approached him and basically tasked him with this in order to get a handle on the nation's finances. Washington felt that, okay, if we are going to get this nation up and running and we're going to be successful and prosperous, we're going to need to have a good handle on our finances. How much money do we owe? How much money do we have coming in? What are our debts? What are our credits? And so forth, just to kind of have an idea on where we are financially. So Hamilton, remember, is a banker by trade. So Hamilton is a perfect man for this job. He's the perfect guy to make an assessment of our financial situation. So he produces a series of reports. There's 4 of them, and on each of these 4 reports is part of this overall report on the public credit. It takes him a year or so to compile all this data. Basically, this report, in a nutshell, is our financial and economic condition, the things we just talked about. One of the big important points that he makes in this report is the problem of our war debt. We've got a massive amount of war debt at this time. Basically, around $52 million the federal government owes to various investors. During the Revolution, the federal government, or the Continental Congress at the time, had borrowed heavily in order to finance the war. And most of this debt was held by American citizens, private investors who had bought what we call war bonds. Basically it's a loan. A bond is a loan from a loan to the federal government. If you buy a savings bond, or if your grandmother gives you a savings bond for your birthday, basically this $50 bond or $100 bond or whatever, you have loaned the federal government $100, and in exchange they'll give you this bond and agreed to pay back this $100 with interest after a certain number of years. So this is how the federal government borrows money, is that they sell these bonds, and that process still exists today. This is still how the federal government borrows money, and that process began during the Revolution. So there's about $52 million in bonds that have been sold, or this debt that the federal government has accumulated. Most of this debt, about 40 million of it, was held by American citizens, and about another 12 million was held by foreigners. Primarily the Dutch and the French investors had loaned America a lot of money as well. So $52 million in debt, and of course this is earning interest every day, because every day that we don't pay it, interest accumulates, and it's becoming very much a problem. We need to figure out a way to pay down this debt, and of course there's a lot of state. Each of the 13 states has their own war debts to pay off too. So in addition to the federal debt, there's a lot of debt at the state level as well. So this is going to be a big problem with our economy, because you owe a lot of debt. That means there's less money you have left over to invest or to improve your economic situation. So in another report, Hamilton proposes a tax on whiskey as a means of generating revenue to pay off this debt. Now, I'm sure many of you are thinking right now that there's a lot of similarities here between what Hamilton is proposing and what happened with the British. The British, remember, taxing various imports in order to raise revenue to pay off their war debt. Here we are doing the same thing. Hamilton is suggesting that now that this new federal government, by virtue of the Constitution, has the authority and the power to raise taxes, that they should do so in order to generate revenue to pay off our war debt. 25%, this is huge. Usually when we talk about tax increases, we're talking about single-digit increases. Here they're talking about 25% tax on whiskey. This is going to be a problem later on. We'll talk about a specific issue that arises from this later on. Hamilton also proposes that we create a federal bank, and this is an obvious thing here, because Hamilton is a banker by trade, and it's no surprise then that he's going to suggest that we have our own bank, especially if we're going to be taking in tax money, we're going to be taking in revenues. We should probably have some place to put that money, and a bank, of course, is the best and most secure place to put it. At the time, the United States, there were only just a handful of banks in the country, and they were completely unregulated. So Hamilton proposes that the federal government create its own bank, so that the money stored in the federal bank can be more closely guarded and less susceptible to the fluctuations of these private banks. So this is something that is not, the Constitution doesn't say anything about creating a bank. Hamilton is proposing this as just a means to manage our money. And he also proposes that the federal government actively promote industry. And this is more of an economic growth proposal than it is dealing with our money. The war debts and the taxes and the bank, these are all kind of go hand in hand. But the promotion of industry is kind of a different thing here. We're talking about the nation's economy. So Hamilton suggests that in order to protect our fledgling industries, we've got some small industries beginning to grow at this point. And we look at these dates here, although we're not going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution for another couple of weeks or so. The Industrial Revolution is underway in the 1790s. So the world is in the process of industrializing at this point. It's just beginning. And so Hamilton thinks that we should get in on this. We should promote industry. Promote the growth of industry here in America, because industry is what's going to generate jobs and incomes and profits, and of course, by extension, tax revenues. And Hamilton believes that if we're going to be a great nation, then we need to be an industrial nation as well. To protect our industries, he proposes tariffs. These are taxes on imports, again, making import goods more expensive than American produced goods, and this will help our industries begin to grow. Not only in the form of tariffs or taxes on imports, but Hamilton believes that grants and loans should be made available from the federal government to help new industries form and get started. So this is a big deal here. The federal government promoting industry actively. This is going to be very controversial. In fact, a lot of the anti-federalists are going to strongly oppose all of these suggestions, particularly this promotion of industry. Keep in mind, Hamilton has no authority to do any of these things. He is just suggesting these things. In his report that he gives to George Washington, he's like, by the way, Mr. President, here's our financial situation. Here's what our problem is. Here's what I think we should do about it. And he submits this for approval. He has no power to do anything. And for that matter, neither does George Washington. George Washington has tasked Hamilton to compile all this information. And Washington will now present this as, okay, FYI, Congress, here's our situation. I've had this assessment made of our financial situation. Here's this information for you all to consider as you make new laws. So this is going to be debated in Congress, all of these proposals. And while Washington does not really try to champion this, he just kind of presents Congress with the information, and Congress will decide what to do with it. A lot of the anti-federalists in Congress are strongly opposed to this. Now, of course, they are hesitant to let the federal government exert a lot of power anyway. That's just in general terms, they are opposed to federal government having a lot of power, and they believe that if it's one thing to raise taxes, which of course is authorized by the Constitution, but the Constitution does not say anything about a bank. So the anti-federalists are concerned about this. They see this as overstepping the bounds of the Constitution. And same thing with promoting industry. Constitution doesn't say anything about the federal government promoting industry, so they have a lot of reservations about these two items here because they are not prescribed by the Constitution. So they believe that in these two cases, the federal government would be exceeding its mandate by the Constitution, and this represents a problem. So this debate on this economic proposal is going to go on for quite a few months. And it's in the course of this debate that we see the emergence of political parties. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, who are going to start calling themselves Republicans at this point. Their first big debate, the first big partisan debate in American politics, is over this economic proposal made by Hamilton. And this is a good time to kind of to outline what these political parties, what their platforms are, basically. We look at the Federalists. They, in general terms, the Federalists advocate a loose interpretation of the Constitution. And this, basically, what they're talking about here is that they're referring to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which declares that Congress has the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to exercise its powers and those of the federal government. This term, they call it the necessary and proper clause. So this article in the Constitution, this necessary and proper clause, this can be interpreted in a variety of ways. Because the terms necessary and proper are both very subjective. What is necessary? What is proper? And who gets to decide what is necessary and proper? So this, Federalists will look at this necessary and proper clause, and they will see it as a prescription for creating the bank. The bank is necessary, so this Article 1, Section 8 authorizes us to create a bank. It's a good idea for these industries to have federal support in the form of tariffs and grants even though the Constitution doesn't say anything specifically about supporting industry, the necessary and proper clause authorizes it indirectly. So this is a loose interpretation of that clause. The Republicans, or you keep in mind these are basically the anti-federalists. They're calling themselves Republicans now. Sounds a little bit more positive than anti-federalist. They advocate a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Basically, the Republicans say that if the Constitution does not specifically authorize it, then you cannot do it. The Constitution doesn't say anything about a bank, so you cannot create a bank. The same goes with the support of industry. Since that the Constitution does not mention any of these things specifically, then you're not authorized to do them. It's a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Generally speaking, too, these two groups, the Federalists essentially were primarily businessmen, business leaders, more well-to-do members of society, privileged segments of society, more educated, manufacturers, creditors, bankers, commercial farmers, those sort of things, large-scale financial activities here. So it's obvious that they're going to support this Hamilton's banking and economic proposal because they would be the ones to primarily benefit from that. And of course, we see to a great extent most of the people who identify themselves as Federalists are from the northern states. And at this time, the northern states are the ones that are most engaged in commercial activities. In the South, or the southern states, are still primarily agriculture. And of course, we see a large majority of the Republicans hail from the southern states. Plantation owners, backcountry farmers, small-scale economic activities. These people tend to believe that the federal government should have less power, should be more restricted in how they use that power, and they are especially opposed to government's support of industry because most of that support will end up in the north and not the south. So the Southerners in particular are upset about this idea of the federal government sponsoring industrial activity and manufacturing because that's only going to benefit one part of the country, and the South will not be that the recipient of any of that benefit. So while not all Federalists are from the North and not all Republicans are from the South, we see a significant percentage of these two groups coming from those two sections of the country. And the debate over Hamilton's economic proposals will generally fall along these sectional lines that have already kind of been established between North and South. So we see here this is another small factor that's going to play into further dividing these two sections of the country. Over here we're talking about economic issues. You know, we mentioned how the issue of slavery in the Great Compromise, or the Three-Fifths Compromise, how that issue of representation, a political issue, slavery was a factor there. We see here an economic issue that's also beginning to divide generally along those sectional lines. So another piece of our North versus South story is starting to take shape here during this economic debate. So what ends up happening is that we see, as a result of the debate, there was actually more support in Congress for Hamilton's plan than there was opposition to it. So the plan is going to pass, especially once George Washington decides to put his support behind this plan. Washington, stayed out of it until basically the last minute. Washington, of course, had great respect for Hamilton, and Washington saw the value of this economic plan in terms of strengthening the nation's economy. So Washington indicated that he would support this particular plan, and that's what's going to get a lot of other people behind it here. So while Washington generally tried to avoid any kind of, or using any of his influence to sway Congress one way or the other, here his support for this economic plan will generate further support for it in Congress. So once Washington indicates his support, some of the anti-federalists, or the Republicans rather, they will indicate that they'll get behind this as well. But there's a condition. Thomas Jefferson, who's kind of the chief spokesperson of the Republicans at this point, he'll put a condition on this. We'll approve this. This is where our compromise comes in. We will approve Hamilton's financial plan with a few conditions. First and foremost, Thomas Jefferson indicates that he wants the nation's capital to be moved out of the North and into the South. Right now, the nation's capital is in New York City. Jefferson suggests that we move the nation's capital to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. doesn't really exist at this point. Washington, D.C. is a city that will be built from scratch to function as the nation's capital. So it's going to be designed from the ground up as a capital city for the United States. And Washington, D.C., of course, is on the border between Maryland and Virginia. So it's kind of right there in the South, surrounded by two southern states, Maryland and Virginia. Basically, Jefferson said he wanted this. If we're going to give this federal government so much power, I want it to be where I can keep an eye on it, literally in his own backyard. Jefferson's Monticello plantation is very near Washington, D.C. So Jefferson wants to keep an eye on this federal government, so they agree to move the nation's capital into Washington, D.C. as a result of Hamilton's financial plan being passed. It's important to note here, too, that not all of Hamilton's financial plan is going to pass, only parts of it. Basically, what will happen is that the federal government is going to take responsibility for the state's war debts. So basically, the federal government will not only be paying off its own debt, it's going to take responsibility for all the states' debts too. So basically, this frees up the states to grow their economies without the burden of a lot of debt. So this is gonna serve a couple of functions. Basically it'll free up those states' economies to grow without the burden of debt, but it'll also further subordinate the state governments to the federal government. It's kind of like if you borrow money from your parents. You rack up a bunch of credit card debt your first semester in school, and your parents volunteer to pay off that debt. That way it frees your money up to help make you a little bit more economically flexible. But there's going to be strings attached. Now that your parents bailed you out with this paying off your debts, you kind of owe them a favor. So they'll probably call that favor in one day later on, maybe not. But this is going to be kind of hanging over you. And this is what we're going to see with the relationship between the federal government and the state government as a result. Federal government assuming all the states' debts, the state governments are now obliged to subordinate themselves further to the federal government. And a lot of people criticize this, but they believe that the economic benefits would be worth the risk here. Another thing that they're going to do, they will create a Bank of the United States, give it a charter for 20 years, and then they'll have to renew it. The bank will be based in Philadelphia for obvious reasons. That's kind of the financial center of the nation at this point. Congress will also pass the 25% tax on whiskey. So they did everything except set aside money, federal funds, to promote industry. That was going too far as Jefferson was concerned. Jefferson believed that the federal government becoming directly involved with promoting industry was an abuse of power, and it benefited one part of the country more than the other. And so they decided not to include that. So most of Hamilton's plan is going to pass, except for government promotion of industry. That's not going to pass, and for the reasons we just talked about. There will be a slight rise in tariffs, but it's going to be kind of nominal. So we've got our another example of compromise here. This financial plan is a result of another great compromise. This is of course our pattern. We talked about this last week with the establishing of the Constitution. This idea of compromise is going to be one of the ways that our federal government is able to get things done, to reach some sort of consensus between those who support an idea and those who are opposed to it. A compromise is Each side gets a little bit of what they want, and each side, of course, has to give up a little bit as well. So that's what took place here in this compromise. A deal was made. So this is where our nation's capital moves to Washington, D.C., and where, of course, where it is today. This is how that story began. Quick little note here on political parties. While the political parties haven't formed officially at this point, during Washington's first term in office, the political parties were starting to take shape as a result of this debate on Hamilton's economic proposals. But they won't actually form officially until towards the end of Washington's second term in office. We started out as Federalists and Anti-Federalists, just two groups of people who advocated different ideas. Those will coalesce into official political parties later on in Washington's second term in office, and of course the Anti-Federalists are going to start calling themselves Democratic Republicans, or just Republicans for short, and this is where we'll begin at the end of Washington's second term. If we're going to refer to this graphic numerous times over the course of the semester, because a lot of these political parties are going to change names. People will switch sides. Some parties will disappear. New parties will be created. It's a lot to keep track of. So I've included this graphic on D2L in the supplemental study materials. You'll want to refer to this as we go on, because over the rest of the semester, I'm just going to refer to these parties by name. I'm not really going to go into a lot of detail on how exactly they changed. I'll leave this for you to refer to so you can keep it straight in your mind. So in 1794, we're going to be faced with one of our first big crises of George Washington's administration. And this is this is the first crisis that we will face operating under this new Constitution. And remember, when we talked about the Constitution last week, Shays' Rebellion was one of those red flag moments, a catalyst that helped give a sense of urgency to the need for creating a new government. Well, this Whiskey Rebellion is going to be a similar incident, but now we've got the Constitution, so we're going to be able to test and see whether or not the provisions that we put into the Constitution to allow the federal government to address crises, we're going to see if that process works now, because we now have a real crisis to use as a test, kind of an experiment. Whiskey Rebellion, as you might already have guessed, this is a response to the 25% whiskey tax. Remember, that's a huge tax. A lot of people are going to be very upset about this, particularly farmers in western Pennsylvania. Now, it's not that the western farmers were alcoholics, or that they loved whiskey so much that they were willing to fight over it. Well, for some that's true, but primarily one of the reasons that these farmers are so upset over this whiskey tax is that this is part of how they make their living. Whiskey is distilled from wheat. Wheat grown in these farms in Pennsylvania. These wheat farmers, they're not just growing wheat to make their own bread. They're selling this on the market too. So they're selling wheat at the farmers market. A lot of these farms, they grow a lot of wheat. They sell it overseas to England and so forth. But the thing is, wheat has a limited shelf life. You can put it up for a while, but if you store it too long, eventually it'll rot, or rats or rodents will get into it. You can't keep it forever. So you grow more wheat than you need for yourself over the course of the summer, and you put up the rest for the winter to sell when you need to help provide you a source of income over the winter months. Well, it's easier to store this if you distill it into whiskey. Whiskey has a longer shelf life. It takes up less space. It won't spoil. And of course, you can sell it for a higher price than you could just by selling the wheat by itself. So farmers, especially in western Pennsylvania, they distill a lot of their wheat into whiskey for this purpose, because it provides them an income during the winter months when they can't grow wheat. So a heavy tax on whiskey now cuts deeply into their pockets, because they're not going to be able to sell the whiskey if they pass along this price increase to their customers. So they're going to end up having to eat this tax out of their own pockets. A lot of them can't afford to do that. So here we now have these farmers in western Pennsylvania very upset over this whiskey tax, which is cutting deeply into into their livelihood, making it more difficult for them to support their families, and they rise up in protest. What happens is that it starts kind of small scale, but what ends up happening is that when these federal tax collectors, the revenue agents, as they call them, or the revenuers, as they will come to be known, when the revenuers come to collect the taxes, these farmers in western Pennsylvania, they react violently. What will end up happening is that they will attack the tax collectors. They'll burn down their homes, and some of them will be tarred and feathered, and some of them will actually even be murdered. Taking a look at some images here, we see here a group of whiskey rebels attacking a tax collector. They've tarred and feathered him here. And of course, we talked about that during the Revolution, how what a brutal torture this is. And you see here the wife and children of the tax collector crying outside their burning home. So these whiskey rebels, they show no mercy to these tax collectors. What's unfortunate is that this guy, this tax collector here, he didn't make the law. He's not going to be the one to benefit from the law. He's just the guy out here who is tasked with collecting the tax. Torturing him or killing him is not going to do anything to stop this tax. It's just basically just killing an innocent man for nothing. It's not his fault that this tax is in place, but he's the most convenient target. So, and this is the case oftentimes with protesters. They go after the most convenient target who may or may not necessarily be the one who is the source of the problem. So, and of course, you see here even the dog is kind of trying to get in on it. So this tax collector is being brutalized. This is what happens out in the western part of Pennsylvania. By the summer of 1794, this army of whiskey rebels had grown to about 7,000 men, and they stormed the city of Pittsburgh and threatened to. They converged on the courthouse in Pittsburgh and the tax offices, and they threatened to burn the whole city to the ground unless they get some relief from this new tax law. And of course, here we're looking at an illustration that appeared in a state newspaper at the time, showing the whiskey rebels. They've tarred and feathered another tax collector here, and of course they're rioting. Got outside the liquor store, obviously, where the whiskey is sold. And so again, they're threatening to burn down the whole town of Pittsburgh unless they get some kind of relief. Well, here's where the crisis really starts to take shape. With Shays' Rebellion that happened years before, there was no way to deal with this type of situation. Under the Articles of Confederation, in the old days, the state of Pennsylvania would be totally left to themselves to deal with this, and they'd be in the same situation that Massachusetts was in with the Shays' Rebellion. All the men that they would have called up for the militia are the same men who are a part of this rebel army. So Pennsylvania is in a tough spot here. They can't do anything about this on their own. But we've got the Constitution now, which authorizes the federal government to step in and assist the state of Pennsylvania in this matter. And that's exactly what happens. So per the Constitution, George Washington will lead an army, or Congress basically. Congress will raise an army, a federal army comprised of the militias of New York and New Jersey and was it? I think a couple other places. Basically, at any rate, Washington will lead this army raised by Congress of the militias of several states, and a total of about 13,000 men. So this is a huge army. And George Washington will lead this army himself. And this is just a little bit of trivia for you here. This is the first and only time in U.S. history where a sitting president will actually lead troops in the field. This is it never happens again after this. But it's not that Washington was trying to be a hero here. He's following the Constitution. The Constitution says that the president, one of his duties is to serve as commander-in-chief of the army. Well, George Washington, and that's all it says in the Constitution. The president will serve as commander-in-chief of the army. So George Washington reads the Constitution. He's like, well, I guess I'm supposed to be out there leading this army. So he gets on his uniform, he gets on his horse, and he goes out and he leads this 13,000-man federal army into western Pennsylvania. Of course, later on in later years, we'll realize as a nation that it's probably not a good idea for the president to be on the field of battle. It just seems like an unnecessary risk. So the president, as commander-in-chief, is more of a figurative or an administrative duty and not an actual field duty. So George Washington, again, the only time a sitting president, will lead troops in the field in this Whiskey Rebellion. What ends up happening is that when Washington and this 13,000 man federal army shows up in western Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebels just quit and go home. Most of these men, they had fought during the Revolution. They had fought. A lot of them had fought under George Washington. And for many of them, they're like, okay, yeah, I'm really upset about this whiskey tax, but I'm not going to take up arms against George Washington. Something about that just doesn't seem right. So this is a very intimidating force. 13,000 federal troops led by the president himself. It's a startling image, very, very, very intimidating. And this rebellion ends with no more bloodshed. The federal army does not engage the rebels. The rebels disperse and go home. A few of the ringleaders are arrested and put on trial, but for the most part, these rebels go home, and the whole thing ends with no more bloodshed. What's important about this is that our Constitution has survived its first big test during a crisis. If you remember, one of the reasons why they decided to draft a new Constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation was the fact that the federal government was unable to respond to a crisis during Shays' Rebellion. So here, during the Whiskey Rebellion, the federal government responded to a crisis, assisted another state deal with a crisis in a manner that was prescribed by the Constitution. Everything that happened here happened exactly in accordance with this Constitution, this new plan of action that they had put into place. So they know it works. Up to this point, it was just a theory. It was just something outlined on a piece of paper. But in this Whiskey Rebellion, they actually proved that the system works the way it was intended to, and a larger crisis is averted, and of course a smaller crisis is brought to a successful conclusion. This is important because now it helps to give people a lot of faith in the Constitution. The fact that the state governments were willing to subordinate themselves to the federal government in this matter. Like say those neighboring states, New York and Maryland, both providing militia troops to form this federal army. Congress, raising this army, the president commanding it. Everything that happened was the way it was outlined in the Constitution. So it builds people's faith and confidence in the Constitution and the federal government, for that matter. So this is an important event because it really proves the validity of our Constitution. When we come back for the next session, we're going to talk about some diplomatic crises that come up during George Washington's presidency, and then later on we'll finish that up with John Adams. French Revolution. We'll talk about how once again things going on in Europe are going to have a big impact on what's going on here in America. Even though we're independent now, we're no longer under European control. The events in Europe still have an impact on what we do here in America, because at this point, during George Washington's presidency, we still have very close ties to both England and France. So that French Revolution is going to have an impact on what we do here, and that's where we're going to pick it up with our next session.